Hey, what's up, Chevre? How y'all doing? You good, right? Good. Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Samaches, Daf 68 of Masechta Yoma. Daf 68, we're moving on the avoda of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, the burning of the cow and the goat, and the Tumas Begadim that's involved with that. And then we move on to the 7th parak of Masechta Yoma, which is pretty cool because there's 8 parakim of Masechta Yoma, which means that we're beginning to close in on Masechta Yoma, which is exciting. So we're going to start the 7th parak of Masechta Yoma, which discusses the prayers that the Kohen Gadol would read from the Sefer Torah and say certain prayers, which is very, very interesting. So let us get started here on Daf Samach Zayin Amud at the Mishnah, Balawetel Parvisoyer and Esrofin. Okay, so now he comes to the cow and the goat that are to be burned outside of Yerushalayim. Kira Botzi Asemurain, and he tore them open and ripped out their guts. He took out the parts that go on the Mizbeach. Kilon Bamiklos, and then he somehow put these the cow and the goat, right, the Sar Hashem, on the on like these poles, and the Kohanim would carry them out, and somehow, I don't know, they weaved them. I don't know. One was like probably the goat was hanging upside down, and maybe the cow was hanging upside down underneath it or something. Somehow they were like crisscrossing in some kind of way. Okay. Wait, where? I skipped. I totally skipped. By the way, it's a part of Sarah Nesaf and Kron Votias Moran. Right? So he comes to the cow and the goat that needs to now be burnt. So tore them open, pulls out the parts that go on the Mizbeach. And then he takes those emurin, the parts that are going to go on the Mizbeach, and he puts them on a tray. Okay? Now, literally, he then burns them on the Mizbeach, but that's not true. He doesn't burn them until a little bit later, as the Gemara is going to say. So really what's happening is that he's putting them on this tray so that later he will burn them. Kilon b'miklos, and then he put the cow and the goat on poles, somehow like one underneath the other, and they took out the 4 Kohanim would carry the cow and the goat on 2 poles, two in the front, 2 in the back, and right, meaning 2 poles, 4 Kohanim would carry them, and take out the cow and the goat to where it would be burned outside of Jerusalem. Now, at what point would the clothing of the people burning the cow and the goat? At what point would their clothing become tamei? Because the clothing of the people who were involved in burning the cow and the goat would become tamei. So the Tanakhama says that their clothing becomes tamei from the time that they exit from the Azara, whereas Reb Shimon says that their clothing becomes tamei once the fire sort of consumes or kind of is burning most of it. Now, as I pointed out in the Mishnah, that they weren't actually going to burn the emurim until a little bit later. So the Gemara says, wait, do you really think that they were putting the emurim on the tray and then immediately burning them? Rather to say to burn them on the Mizbeach, meaning at a later point when it becomes time to burn them on the Mizbeach, then they will take the emurim from the tray and burn them on the Mizbeach. Klon b'miklos, they would somehow weave together the cow and the goat. I imagine one on top of the other in some way. Amr Yochanan Kamin Kliya, like a braid of sorts. Okay. Tana, it was taught in the Brayso, Lohayo Minatron Nituach Bisar Ola, Ella or Al Gabe Basar. You hear that? That when it comes to a Korban Ola, now Korban Ola, of course, is entirely burnt on the Mizbeach. So they would remove the hide from the animal and then cut up the animal and burn it on the Mizbeach. Now, when it came to the Parvisoyer, they would not remove the hide. So they would cut up the animal but leave the hide on. Minani mili. How do we know this? The Tanya, Taka as we learn in the Brisa. Rebbe Omer, says Rebbe, Nemerkan or uvasa uferish. It says by the parvasoir, hide and flesh and waste. V'nemer lahalan or uvasa uferish. And it also says, I believe by the par kohen Mashiach, that if the Kohen Gadol sins and does an avera that would normally somebody would bring a korban chatas for, so he has the special korban par Mashiach, the par kohen Mashiach. So it says over there, or uvasar uferish, hide and flesh and waste. Malahalan aydei nituach v'lo aydei hefshit. Well, just like by the par kohen Mashiach, you cut up the cow, but you leave on the hide. Afkan aydei nituach v'lo aydei hefshit. So here also, by the parvasar of Yom Kippur, you cut up the animals, but you leave on the hide. How do we know dartin that by the parvasar that the par kohen Mashiach that you cut it up but leave on the hide? The Tanya is willing advice of vikirbo ufirsho v'hotzi. It's intestines and it's waste, and you take it out. Melamit shemotzio shalem, which the Brisa says teaches us that you take it out whole, that you take it outside of Jerusalem to burn it whole. Yachol yisufenu shalem. Is it possible that just like you take it out of Jerusalem whole, you also burn it whole? Nemerkan rosho uchrav, v'nemer lahalan rosho uchrav. It says by the parvasar rosho uchrav, and it also says by the korban ola rosho uchrav. Right? It also mentions by the korban ola its head and its feet, its legs. So just like by the korban ola, you cut it up into pieces, so also by the par kohen Mashiach, you cut it up into pieces. But if by the ola, you also remove the hide, so wouldn't I then say that by the par kohen Mashiach, you have to remove the hide? Talmud He says it's intestines and it's waste. Talmuda. What does this have to do with anything? Just like the waste of the animal is inside of the intestines, so also the meat is inside of the hide. So that is how we know that you leave on the hide. So you cut up the par kohen Mashiach into pieces, but you leave on the hide. And we then compare that to the parvasar of Yom Kippur, that you cut it into pieces, but you leave on the hide. Very beautiful. Now, at what point does the clothing of the Kohen, or does it have to dafka be a Kohen? That's an interesting kasha. I don't know, does it have to dafka be a Kohen? That's an interesting kasha. I don't know the answer, Lamaisa. The fellow who's going, or the people who are going to burn the parvasar of Yom Kippur, so their clothing becomes tamei. So the shaila is, at what point do they become tamei? So we saw machlokas in the Mishnah that according to the Tanakama, it's when they leave the azara, and according to Reb Shimon, it's once the fire kind of starts consuming the majority of the meat. Tanarabanan, the rabbis taught, Yotzia mechutz lamachne v'sarfu. Okay, so it says in the context of the parvasar of Yom Kippur that you take it outside of the camp, which is singular, and you burn it. But lahalam atanosin loim shalosh machnos v'chan atanosin loim machna achas. So 1 second, what's going on? When it comes to the par kohen Mashiach, so we give them three machnas, 3 camps. So now, as Rashi points out, the 3 camps would be, of course, the Machne Shechina, the Machne Levia, and the Machne Yisrael. And Rashi says the Machne Shechina is the Azara, the Machne Levia is Har HaBayis, and the Machne Yisrael is Yerushalayim. So when it comes to the Par Kohen Mashiach, so you bring out the dead cow that you're going to be burning outside of all 3 camps, outside of Jerusalem. Okay. Now, it says by the parvasar of Yom Kippur, only 1 camp, which implies that you only take it outside of the Azara. That's it. So imkin lamunemar michutz lamachne. So again, right, so meaning, so we want to know, and as Rashi points out, the Gemara, it doesn't read so smoothly, but the point is that when it comes to when it comes to the Par Kohen Mashiach, so you burn it outside of Jerusalem, outside of all three camps. And we want to say that, and this isn't clear from the Gemara, but Rashi explains, we want to say that just like by the Par Kohen Mashiach, you burn the cow outside of all three camps, also by the Par B'Sar of Yom Kippur, you burn it outside of all three camps. Now, if that's the case, then how come it only says Michutz Lamachne, which is singular, by the Par B'Sar of Yom Kippur? If in fact we're taking it outside of all three camps, then why does it say only one singular camp? So Lomar Lecha to say to you, Chutz Lamachne Achas Mitamim Begadim. So what we learn from the singular camp by the Par B'Sar of Yom Kippur is to say that once you leave the one camp, once you leave the Azara, already the clothing of the people who are going to be burning the Par B'Sar become Tameh from that point. Very good. Okay, so when it comes to the Par Kohen HaMashiach, so you bring the cow outside of all three camps. The same applies to the Par B'Sar of Yom Kippur. The question is, why then does it say a singular camp by the Par B'Sar of Yom Kippur? And the answer is to say that once the people who are going to be burning the Par B'Sar of Yom Kippur have left the Azara, at that point already their clothing becomes tummy. How do we know that when it comes to the Par Kohen Mashiach, that by the par that the Kohen Gadol brings if he does an Avera, so how do we know that his cow is burnt outside of all three camps? The Tanyas, we learn in the Brayso Votzias, Kol Apar Chutz L'Shalosh Machnos. Okay, so it says that he takes out the cow, and that means outside of all three camps by the Par Kohen Mashiach. Now, fact the Gemara, wait a second. How do we know that this means outside of all three camps? Maybe Taka just means outside of one camp, outside of the Azara, V'zeu. Well, when it says by the Paralim Davar Shel Tzibor, who could tell me what Paralim Davar Shel Tzibor is? Very good. Paralim Davar Shel Tzibor is when the Bezdin says that the Sanhedrin says you're allowed to do something. I don't know, something let's say is allowed on Shabbos or something. So everyone does this thing on Shabbos, and then it turns out that it's taka not allowed. So everybody made this mistake. So they bring one cow for the entire tzibur. Right? So it says by the Para Eda al Mechutz Lamachne. Now it says by the Paralim Davar Shel Tzibor that you have to take it outside of the camp. Now She'ein Tamud Lomar, we didn't need to say that. Shevi Kvar Nemar V'Sarf Oso Kasher Sarf Es Apar Rishon. Well, because the pasuk already says that you have to burn the Paralim Davar Shel Tzibor just like you burn the Par Kohen HaMashiach. And we already know that the Par Kohen HaMashiach you have to burn outside of the camp. So if that's the case, then how come it also says that you have to burn the Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor outside of the camp? Mimele, if it's just like the Par Kohen HaMashiach, which is outside the camps, then also the Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor is going to be outside of the camp. So then why does it say that you have to burn the Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor outside of the camp? To give it a second camp, to say that, well, you don't just take it out of the Machne Shechina, you also take it out of the Machne Leviyah. And when it says by the Deshen, right, meaning we know that every single morning in the Beis HaMikdash, the first thing that they would do is the Trumas HaDeshen. They would separate some of the ashes from on top of the Mizbech and put it next to the Mizbech, but then afterwards, lav dafka afterwards, but I think whenever there was just, too much ashes on the Mizbech, they would then take all of the ashes and bring it outside of the camp. Now, it doesn't need to say, in the context of taking out these ashes, that you had to bring them outside of the camp, because it already says by the Par Kohen Mashiach, El Shefech HaDeshen, that you take it outside of the camp to the place where you would dump all of the ashes of the Mizbeach, which means Memele, we already know from the pasuk by Par Kohen and Mashiach that you dump out all the ashes from the Mizbeach outside of the camp. So how come it says also by these ashes from the Mizbeach that you got to schlep them outside of the camp, if we already know that from the inference of the pasuk by Par Kohen and Mashiach? So ten lo machne shlishis, to say that, well, what we learn out from this mentioning of outside of the camp by the ashes of the Mizbeach is to say that Taka, you bring them outside of a third camp. Very, very beautiful, right? So it says by the Par Kohen Mashiach that you bring it outside of the camp. Now it says also by the Par Davar Shel Tzibur they bring it outside of the camp to teach that not only just one camp but even two camps. And then it also says by all the ashes from the Mizbeach they bring it outside of the camp, which didn't need to be written. So to say that it's outside of three camps, to say that all of these cases by the Par Kohen Mashiach, the Par Helim Davar Shel Tzibur, the ashes, and then also by inference also the Par V'Sar of Yom Kippur, all of these animals are going to be burnt outside of all three camps. Very good. Very, very good. So, Givaldik. That is like the Tanakama, right? We just explained the Tanakama in our Mishnah. Again, the Tanakama in our Mishnah had said that you burn the Par V'Sar of Yom Kippur outside of all three camps. So how come it says Amichutz Amachne then by the Par V'Sar of Yom Kippur? To say that once you leave the first camp, already your clothing becomes tummy. Now, what about according to Reb Shimon, who says that no, not true. When does your clothing become tummy? Their clothing becomes tummy only once they mamish start burning the cow and the goat outside of all three camps, and once the fire has already consumed most of the meat. So, what does he do with this michutz lamachne, this singular encampment? Reb Shimon ay michutz lamachne ma'ovadei. What is he who says that their clothing only becomes tummy later? What does Reb Shimon do with michutz lamachne? He needs it for the following brisa. Rabbi Eliezer Omer says, Rabbi Eliezer, Ne'emar kam michutz lamachne, v'ne'emar lahalim michutz lamachne. Well, it says by Par V'Sar of Yom Kippur, michutz lamachne, outside of the camp, and it also says lemaise by the Para Aduma, michutz lamachne, outside of the camp. Makan chutz l'shalosh machnes. Well, just like by the Par V'Sar of Yom Kippur, it's, as we said, it's outside of all three camps. So from the Gzer Shavim, Chutz Lamachne, by Par V'Sar of Yom Kippur, and by the Para Aduma, Af Lahalim Chutz L'Gimel Machnes. So also by the Para Aduma, it's going to be shechted, it's going to be slaughtered outside of all three camps. Umalahalim b'mizracha sheyushalayim, Af Kam b'mizracha sheyushalayim, and to then apply it back to the Par V'Sar of Yom Kippur, just like by Para Aduma, we know that it is slaughtered in the east of Jerusalem, right, outside of Jerusalem to the east, right? We know because the Kohen who slaughters it is looking into the Heichel. So also on the Par V'Sar of Yom Kippur are burnt outside of Yerushalayim to the east. Now, according to the rabbis, though, who do not learn out the Gzeir Shava of Michutz Lamachne to teach that you burn the Par V'Sar of Yom Kippur to the east, or outside of Jerusalem to the east, so then where do they burn the Par V'Sar of Yom Kippur? Kedetanya, well, it's like we learned in a brisa, Eichan Nisrafin, where do we burn the Par V'Sar of Yom Kippur? Litzvona Shayushalayim Michutz L'Shalosh Machnes, outside of Jerusalem, outside of all three camps to the north. So, as Rashi points out, because anyways, when it comes to Kodshei Kodshim, Shchitasim Batzafon, you slaughter them in the north, and just like that avodah is done in the north, so also the burning of it will be in the north as well, outside of Jerusalem. Rabbi Yossi Omer says, Rabbi Yossi, Abeis Hadeshen Nisrafin, says Rabbi Yossi that you have to make sure that when you burn the Par V'Sar of Yom Kippur, that there's already ashes there. Right, that there should already be ashes there, that you should be burning the Par V'Sar in a place where there's already ashes from the Mizbeach. Rava says, who is the author who argues on Rabbi Yossi and says that you don't need the ashes of the Mizbeach to already be there when you burn the ashes, when you burn the Par V'Sar of Yom Kippur? Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, who says Rava, it's Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, the Tanya, as we learn in the Brisa, El Shefech HaDeshen Yisarif, Sheyehei L'Sham Deshen. That the Tanakam says, that the Pasuk says that you have to burn the Par, this is the Par Kohen Mashiach, I believe. Yeah, that you have to burn it, El Shefech HaDeshen Yisarif, where the Deshen is, right, the Deshen from the Mizbeach, Shei L'Sham Deshen, that there should be therein the ashes from the Mizbeach. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov whereas Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says no, you don't necessarily need that there to be ashes, rather just that the place where you're going to burn it needs to be on like an angle so that the ashes can, I guess, slide down somewhere, I guess. So Rava wants to argue that Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says that you don't need that there should be ashes there already, and therefore the Tanakama, who doesn't say anything about ashes, right? Rabbi Yossi says that there has to be ashes there, but Tanakama seems to say that you don't need ashes there. So Rava wants to say that is Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, who doesn't say anything about ashes. Amrle Abai, but Abai says to Rava, V'dilma b'mkomo meshubach hu de pligi. Maybe Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov and the Tanakama are really just arguing about whether the place needs to be on an angle or not, but not necessarily about if you need ashes. Maybe Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov would also agree that you need to have ashes there. So it says Abai that it's inconclusive. Tana Rabbanon, the rabbis taught Asoref mitame begadim. So the fellow who burns the parvasoir is mitame begadim. His clothing becomes tame. V'lo ametzis asor, but not the fellow who lights the fire. V'lo masadus ha'mayracha, not the fellow who sets up the fire in advance, right? Sets up like the wood, the pyre. Ve'ezu asoref, and who is the fellow who burns these animals? That is somebody who is involved at the time that it is being burnt. Is it possible that even once the animals become ash, they would still be mitame begadim at that point? It says no, they become, right, the animals are mitame begadim, but once it becomes ash, they're no longer mitame begadim. Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon Omer says Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon hapar mitame, that the cow is mitame, nitach abasar eino mitame, but once already the flesh becomes charred, so at that point it's no longer going to be mitame begadim. My benayu ika benayu deshavi charucha. The nafkamina is if it kind of got charred. So if it gets charred, so then the Tanakam would say that it's still matame begadim until it becomes ash. Whereas Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov, Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon would say already once it becomes charred, it would not be matame begadim. Very exciting stuff. Says the Mishnah, Amrula l'kohen gadol. So then they said to the kohen gadol, Hiki asar lamidbar. The goat has arrived in the desert. You can go weiter in your avoda, because until the goat arrived in the desert, he couldn't go weiter. How did they know that the goat arrived in the desert? Well, they would have fellows, they would have people between the Beis Hamikdash and between Yerushalayim and the desert. And then they would have like a chain of people, and they would wave these flags, and each person, when he saw that the person in front of him was waving the flag, they would wave a flag until the chain made it back to Jerusalem, and they would know that since everyone's been waving the flags, that the goat has arrived in the desert. Rabbi Yehuda says, wait a second, you didn't actually need the flags. You could have just known that on your own. How would you know it on your own? Well, from Jerusalem until the desert was 3 mil. Hochen mil v'chozen mil. So you can have somebody escort the fellow who is taking the goat a mil, right? Meaning, so if we're saying that the desert is 3 mil away, so escort him for 1 mil, and then leave him, right? Because 1 mil is Tchum Shabbos already. Then walk back to Jerusalem, so now that's 2 mil. V'sharon kedei mil, and then you just wait the amount of time that it takes to walk a mil. And at that point, Memela, that's the amount of time it takes to walk 3 mil. And you can assume that the goat has already arrived in the desert. Rabbi Shmuel Omer says, Rabbi Shmuel v'alusim acher oyeloim. There was another sign that they could use. Lashon shel zahoris ha'yikasha apischol shel heichal. Of course, we know that there was a some red wool that was tied at the entrance of the heichal. Uchshegiasar lamidbar hayaloshin malbin. And once the goat would arrive in the desert, the wool would become white. That if your sins will be like this red wool, well, they then will become white. So therefore, says Rabbi Yishmael, you can just know that the goat has arrived in the desert once the wool becomes white. Gewaldig. Says the Gemara, meaning because the wool was by the Heichel, so once they saw the wool by the Heichel become white, they knew that the goat has arrived. Amar Abaye, Shmamino, Beis Chidudo, Bamidbar Kaima. So says Abaye, it means that this Beis Chidudo is in the desert, and once the goat reaches the desert, they can go weiter in Avoda. And what we see from Rabbi Yehuda's statement, that once already you could figure out the amount of time that it takes to walk to this Beis Chidudo, which is 3 mil away. You can go weiter in the Avoda. So we see that according to Rabbi Yehuda, once the goat arrives at the desert, so the mitzvah has already been done, and the Kohen Gadol can move on with his Avoda. Hadron Oloch, Shnei Seirei. We will come back to you, 2 goats. Friends, we now begin the 7th parak. Balo Kohen Gadol Likros. The Kohen Gadol now goes to read from the Sefer Torah. If he wants to read from the Sefer Torah while still wearing the Bigdei Lavon that he wore lefnai v'lefnim, givaldig. And if not, then he could wear his own white tunic. Chazan HaKnesses noto Sefer Torah v'nosno l'rosh HaKnesses. So now the Chazan, like the Shamus, who works in the synagogue, which is interesting. There was like a synagogue apparently on Har HaBayis. Super interesting. Because that, I don't know, it seems to be implying that sort of they had these standard prayers already during the second temple, which is very interesting. So the Shamus of the synagogue would take a Sefer Torah v'nosno l'rosh HaKnesses and would give it to the Gabbai. Rosh HaKnesses nosno l'skan. The Gabbai would give it to the deputy Kohen Gadol. V'asgan nosno l'Kohen Gadol, and then the Skan would give it to the Kohen Gadol. V'Kohen Gadol omid makabel, and the Kohen Gadol would receive the Sefer Torah, and he would be standing, and v'koreh, he would read Ach Remos v'Ach Be'asar. He would read, of course, from Ach Remos. He would also read from the psukim about Yom Kippur in Parshas Emor. V'gol Sefer Torah, and then he would roll up the Sefer Torah, umanicho b'cheiko, and he would hold it against his chest. V'omer, and he would say, Yosef v'mashakaros l'fnechem kasuv kan, and then he would say that, this isn't all that's written in the Sefer Torah. There's more things that are written in the Sefer Torah. The Gemara is going to explain why he has to say this. Uve'asu shebuchumas hapikudim kore al peh, and the psukim in Parshas Pinchas in Sefer Bamidbar, which talks about the Musaf offerings of Yom Kippur, he would read that by heart. And then he would say 8 blessings. Ala Torah is one. V'ala avoda, v'ala udav, v'amichilas ha'avon, v'ala hamikdash, b'fnei atzmo. He would say all of these brachas of Ana Torah, the brachas of like Ritzei, the avoda. I believe there's the Gemara even. No, I don't think the Gemara says what these are. V'ala udah, modim, v'amichilas ha'avon, and a blessing about having forgiveness from sins. Vala Mikdash b'fnei atzma, he would make a separate blessing for the temple. Vala Yisrael b'fnei atzma, he would make a separate blessing for the Yidden. Vala Yerushalayim b'fnei atzma, he would make a special blessing for Jerusalem. Vala Kohanim b'fnei atzma, and a special blessing for the priests. Val Shar Hatfila, and the rest of the prayer. And the Gemara is going to explain what that is. Now, if somebody is observing the Kohen Gadol while he's reading from the Torah, well, then he cannot possibly be observing the par and the cow and the goat while they're being burned. And somebody who is observing the cow and the goat that are being burned cannot be observing the Kohen Gadol while he's reading from the Torah. Not because you're not allowed to look at both. Ella, but because they were not quite next to each other, and you can't be in 2 places at once, so you couldn't really observe both at the same time. Sounds very nice. From the fact that the Mishnah says that if he wants, he could wear his own white garment, well, then that implies that reading from the Sefer Torah must not be technically a service in the temple. Right? Because if it was a service in the temple, then he can't just be wearing his own clothing. And yet it says that even though apparently it's not a technical avoda, he's still allowed to wear his linen garments. So the Gemara wants to say, maybe this seems to be implying that the Bigdei Kahuna you're allowed to get benefit from, because here we see the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, he's doing something that isn't an avoda, because from the fact that he's allowed to wear his own white clothing if he wants, clearly it's not an actual avoda, and yet he's allowed to wear his Bigdei Lavon, implying that you're allowed to get you're allowed to benefit from the Bigdei Kahuna even outside of the context of technical avoda. To which the Gemara says, well, the Mashayni kriya de tzorech avoda. Interesting. So the Gemara says, well, maybe reading from the Torah is different because it might not technically be considered a service, but it's part of the service. Okay, it supports the service. It's a need of the service. You have to do it. So even though it might not technically be defined as a service, but it's in the context of the avodah on Yom Kippur, so it would be okay to wear the Bigdei Kahuna during that. The Ibayalan, because we asked the question, Bigdei Kahuna nidnu le'anus boen or lo nidnu le'anus boen? Are you allowed to get benefit from the priestly garments or not? Toshma, hayu yeshenu b'Bigdei Kodesh. So the Kohanim would not sleep in their Bigdei Kahuna, because we're concerned that if a Kohen sleeps in the Bigdei Kahuna, he might pass gas while he's sleeping, and that wouldn't be proper covered for the Bigdei Kahuna. Sheno udelo hamechol achle. So the Gemara wants to suggest, okay, fine, so you're not allowed to sleep in the Bigdei Kahuna, but you can eat in the Bigdei Kahuna, which would imply that you'd be allowed to get benefit from them. Well, we say, wait, but maybe eating is different because theoretically, eating the korbanos is part of the avoda. Kedetanya, as we learn in the Brisa, or because we learn that the pasuk says that the kohanim eat the korban chatas. So that by the kohanim eating the korbanos, that's how the owners get their atonement, right? The owners come, they bring their korbanos, the kohanim eat them, and by the kohanim eating their korbanos, so then the fellows get atonement. So therefore, even though technically speaking, eating isn't like an actual avoda, but it's a need, it's in the context of the avoda, and therefore they'd be allowed to be wearing their regular clothing. But then, right, so again, we don't necessarily have a proof that you just be allowed to get benefit from the Bigdei Kahuna. But shenu udelo haluche mahalche. But then the Gemara wants to say, well, but maybe we could say, yeah, you're not allowed to sleep in the Bigdei Kahuna, but you're allowed to just walk around in them. So the Gemara says, well, but dinu de aluche namilo. Really, no, you're actually not allowed to just walk around stam in the Bigdei Kahuna. V'seifa it's tzrichale. The only reason why we dafka mentioned sleep, which we wanted to therefore say, implies maybe you could do other things in the Bigdei Kahuna. No, we needed it to teach poshtin umakaplin manichin tachas roshem, to say that no, you're not allowed to sleep in them in the Bigdei Kahuna, but you can fold them up and put them under your head, and that would be considered okay. But general, just stam benefit from the Bigdei Kahuna would not be something that's allowed. Chevre, that was daf samches of Masechta Yoma. Daf Samaches talked about taking the par v'sa'ir out of the Jerusalem in order to burn it. We had a machlokas between the Tanakama and Reb Shimon about at what point do the clothing of the people involved in burning the Bigdei Kahuna become tameh. The Tanakama says they become tameh from the time that they leave the Azara. Reb Shimon says that they become tameh from the time that the fire burns them already. We then discussed also that by the par Kohen Mashiach, as well as the par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor, and the par V'Sa'ir of Yom Kippur, in all of these cases we take out the animals outside of Jerusalem in order to burn them. We then wrapped up the 6th parak of Masechta Yoma, and we began the 7th parak, where we discussed the Kohen Gadol reading from the Sifrei Torah on Yom Kippur, and then we got to an interesting question at the end about can you get benefit from the Bigdei Kahuna. The implication seems to be saying no, you should really limit using the big day kahuna either for the avoda or for things that are sort of attached to the avoda, such as eating the korbanos, things like that. Chevre, that was Daf Samches of Masechet Yoma. I hope you enjoyed it very much. Cheers.